The Story of King Arthur and His Knights by Howard Pyle. Chapter 5th. How King Arthur overcame the enemies of King Leodegrance, and how his royalty was proclaimed. Now, when the next day come, the Duke of Northumberland and 6 knight companions appeared upon the field in front of the castle of Camelot, as he duly declared that he and they would do. And those 7 champions appeared in very great estate. For in front of them rode several heralds with trumpets and tabards, and behind them rode 7 esquires, each esquire bearing the spear, the shield, the crest, and the banneret of the knight who was his lord and master. And the 7 heralds blew on their trumpets so exceedingly loud that the sound thereof penetrated unto the utmost parts of Camelot, so that the people came running from everywhere. And while the heralds blew their trumpets, the 7 esquires shouted, and waved the spears and the bannerets. So those 7 knights rode in such proud estate that those who looked upon them had hardly ever beheld such a splendid presentment of chivalry. So they paraded up and down that field 3 times for its entire length, and meantime a great crowd of people, called thither by the blowing of the heralds' trumpets, stood upon the wall and gazed therefrom at the noble spectacle. And all the court of King Rience came, and stood upon the plain in front of the king's pavilion, and they shouted and cheered the Duke of Northumberland and his 6 knights companions. Meanwhile, King Leodegrance of Camelot was so cast down with trouble and shame that he did not choose to show his face, but hid himself away from all his court, nor would he permit anyone for to come into his presence at that time. Nevertheless, the Lady Guinevere, with sundry of her damsels, went, and when the king denied her to come into him, she spake to him through the door, giving him words of good cheer, saying, My lord king and father, I prithee for to look up and take good cheer unto thyself, for I do assure thee that there is one who hath our cause in his hands, and that one sits, a very glorious champion. And he shall assuredly come by and by ere this day is done, and when he cometh, he shall certainly overthrow our enemies. But King Leodegrance opened not the door, but he said, My daughter, that which thou sayest for to comfort me, for there is no other help for me in this time of trouble, only God, his good strong help and grace. And she said, Nay, I say that which is the truth, and the help that God shall send unto thee he shall certainly send through a worthy champion, who at this moment hath our cause in his hand. So spake the Lady Guinevere, so that whilst King Leodegrance came not forth, yet he was greatly comforted at that which she said to him. Thus passed all that morning and a part of the afternoon, and yet no one appeared for to take up the challenge which the 7 knights had declared. But, whilst the sun was yet 3 or 4 hours high, there suddenly appeared at a great distance a cloud of dust. And in that cloud of dust there presently appeared 5 knights, riding at great speed thitherward. And when these had come nigh unto the walls, lo! the people beheld that he who rode foremost of all was that same white champion who had aforetime overthrown the Duke of Northumberland. Moreover, they perceived that the 4 knights who rode with that white champion were very famous knights and of great prowess and glory of arms. For the one was Sir Gawain, and the other was Sir Owain, and the other was Sir Geraint, and the other was Sir Pelleas. For the people of the castle and the town knew these 4 knights, because they had dwelt for 2 days at Camelot, and they were of such exceeding renown, that folks crowded from far and near for to look upon them whensoever they appeared for to walk abroad. So, when the people upon the walls beheld who these knights were, and when they perceived that white champion who had aforetime brought them such exceeding honour, they shouted aloud for the second time with a voice mightier than that with which they had the first time shouted. Now King Leodegrance heard the people shouting, whereupon hope awoke of a sudden within him. So he straightway came forth with all speed for to see what was ado. And there he beheld those 5 noble champions about to enter the field below the castle walls. And the Lady Guinevere also heard the shouting, and she came forth likewise, and behold, there was the white champion and those 4 other knights. So, when she beheld that white knight and his 4 champions at arms, her heart was like to break within her for pure joy and gladness. Wherefore she wept for the passion thereof, and laughed the while she wept. And she waved a handkerchief unto those 5 noble lords, and kissed her hand unto them, and the 5 knights saluted her as they rode past her and into the field. Now, when the Duke of Northumberland was made aware that those 5 knights had come against him, and his knight companions, for to take up his challenge, he straightway came forth from his pavilion and mounted his horse. And his knights companions came forth and mounted their horses, and he and they went forth to meet those who would come against them. And when the Duke of Northumber had come nigh enough, he perceived that the chiefest of those 5 knights was the white champion, who had aforetime overthrown him. Wherefore he said unto that white champion, Sir knight, I have once before condescended unto thee who art altogether unknown to me, or to anybody else that is here. For, without inquiring concerning thy quality, I ran a course with thee, and lo, by the chance of arms thou didst overthrow me. Now this quarrel is more serious than that. Wherefore I and my companions at arms will not run a course with thee and thy companions, nor will we fight with thee until I first know what is the quality of him against whom I contend. Wherefore I bid thee presently declare thyself, who thou art, and what is thy condition. Then Sir Gawaine opened the umber of his helmet, and he said, Sir knight, behold my face, and know that I am Gawaine, the son of King Lot. Wherefore thou mayst perceive that my condition and estate are even better than thine own. Now I do declare unto thee that yonder white knight is such a quality that he condescends unto thee when he doth combat with thee, and that thou dost not condescend unto him. Ho, Sir Gawaine, quoth the Duke of Umber, what thou sayest is a very strange thing, for indeed there are few in this world who are so exalted that they may condescend unto me. Nevertheless, since thou dost avouch for him, I may not gainsay that which thou sayest. Yet there is still another reason why we may not fight with ye. For behold, we are 7 well-approved and famous knights, and ye are but 5. So consider how unequal are our forces, and that you stand in great peril in undertaking so dangerous an encounter. Then Sir Gawaine smiled right grimly unto that Duke of Northumber. Gramercy for thy compassion, and for the tenderness which thou showest concerning our safety, Sir Duke, quoth he. But, nevertheless, thou mayst leave that matter unto us with entire contented spirit upon thy part. For I consider that the peril in which ye 7 stand is fully equal to our peril. Moreover, wert thou other than a belted knight, a simple man might suppose that thou wert more careful of thine own safety in this matter than thou art of ours. Now at these words the countenance of the Duke of Northumber became altogether covered with red, for he wished that he had, indeed, no great desire for this battle, wherefore he was ashamed because of the words which Sir Gawaine spake to him. So each knight closed his helmet, and all turned their horses, and the one party rode on to the end of the field, and the other party rode to the other end of the field. And there each took their stand and place assigned unto them. And they arranged themselves thus. In the middle was King Arthur, and upon either hand were 2 knights. And in the middle was the Duke of Northumber, and upon either hand were 3 knights. So, when they had thus arrayed themselves, they dressed their spears and their shields, and made them altogether ready for the onset. Then King Arthur and Duke Mordaunt each shouted aloud, and the one party hurled upon the other party with such violence that the ground shook and thundered beneath the hoofs of the horses, and clouds of dust rose up against the heavens. And so they met in the middle of the field with an uproar of such dreadful violence that one might have heard the crashing thereof for the distance of more than a mile away. And when the one party had passed the other, and the dust of the encounter had arisen, lo, 3 of the 7 had been overthrown, and not one of the 5 had lost his seat. And one of those which had been overthrown was Duke Mordaunt of Northumber, and behold, he never more arose again from the ground whereon he lay. For King Arthur had directed his spear into the very midst of his defences, and the spear held, wherefore the point thereof had pierced the shield of the Duke of Northumber, and had pierced his body armour. And so violent was the stroke that the Duke of Northumber had been lifted entirely out of his saddle, and had been cast a full spear's length behind the crupper of his horse. Thus died that wicked man, for as King Arthur drave past him, the evil soul of him quitted his body with a weak noise, like to the squeaking of a bat, and the world was well rid of him. Now when King Arthur turned him about at the end of the course, and beheld that there were but 4 knights left upon their horses of all those 7 against whom he and his companions had driven, he uplifted his spear and drew rein upon his horse, and bespake his knights in this wise: Messieurs, I am aweary of all this quarreling, and do not care to fight any more today. So go ye straightway and engage those knights in battle. As for me, I will abide here and witness your adventure. Lord, said they, we will do our endeavour as thou dost command. So those 4 good knights did as he commanded, and they went forth straightway against those other four, much encouraged that their king looked upon their endeavour. As for the 4 knights companions that remained of the Duke of Northumber's party, they came not forth to the second encounter with so much readiness of spirit as they had done aforetime. For they were now well aware of how great was the excellent prowess of those other knights, and they beheld that their enemies came forth to the second encounter very fiercely, and with great valour and readiness of spirit. Wherefore their hearts melted away within them with doubt and anxiety as to the outcome of this second encounter. Nevertheless, they prepared themselves with such resolve as might be, and came forth as they were called upon to do. Then Sir Gawain drave straight up to the foremost knight, who was a very well-known champion, hight Sir Dinador of Montcalm, and when he had come sufficiently nigh to him, he lifted himself up in his stirrups, and he smote Sir Dinador so fierce a blow that he cleft the shield of that knight asunder, and he cleft his helmet, and parted the blade of his sword brake away and remained therein. And when Sir Dinador felt that blow, his brain swam like water, and he was fain to catch the horn of his saddle to save himself from falling therefrom. Then a great terror straightway fell upon him, so that he drew rein violently to one side. So he fled away from that place with the terror of death hanging above him, like to a black cloud of smoke. And when his companions beheld that stroke that Sir Gawain delivered, and when they beheld Sir Dinador flee away from before him, they also drew rein to one side and fled away with all speed, pursued with an entire terror of their enemies. And Sir Gawain and Sir Owain and Sir Geraint and Sir Pelleas pursued them as they fled, and they chased them straight through the courts of King Rents, so that the knights and nobles of the court scattered hither and thither like chaff at their coming. And they chased those fleeing knights in among the pavilions of King Rent's course, and no man stayed them. And when they had chased those knights entirely away, they returned to that place where King Arthur still held his station, steadfastly awaiting them. Now when the people of Camelot beheld the overthrow of their enemies, and when they beheld how these enemies fled away from before the faces of their champions, they shouted with might and main, and made great acclaim. Nor did they stint their loud shouting when those 4 knights returned from pursuing their enemies and came back onto the White Champion again. And still more did they give acclaim when those 5 knights rode across the drawbridge and into the great gate of town and into the town. Thus ended the great bout at arms, which was one of the most famous in all the history of chivalry of King Arthur's court. Now, when King Arthur had thus accomplished his purposes, and when he had come into the town again, he went on to that merchant of whom he had obtained the armour that he wore, and he delivered that armour back to him again. And he said, "To-morrow day, Sir Merchant, I shall send thee 2 bags of gold for the rent of that armour which thou didst let me have." To this the merchant said, "Lord, it is not needed that thou should recompense me for that armour, for thou hast done great honour unto Camelot by thy prowess." But King Arthur said, "Have done, Sir Merchant, nor must thou forbid what I say. Wherefore, take thou that which I shall send unto thee." Thereupon he went his way, and having set his cap of disguise upon his head, he came back into the Lady Guinevere's gardens again. Now when the next morning had come, and the people of Camelot looked forth, and lo! King Rents had departed entirely away from before the castle. For that night he had struck his pavilions, and had withdrawn his court, and had gone away from that place where he and his people had sat down for 5 days past. And with him he had taken the body of the Duke of Northumber, conveying it away in a litter surrounded by many lighted candles, and uplifted by a particular pomp of ceremony. But when the people of Camelot beheld that he was gone, they were exceedingly rejoiced, and made merry, and shouted and sang and laughed. For they wist not how deeply enraged King Rents was against them, for his enmity aforetime towards King Leodegrance was but a small flame when compared unto that anger that now possessed him. Now that morning Lady Guinevere walked into her garden, and with her walked Sir Gawain and Sir Owain, and lo! there she beheld that gardener's boy again. Then she laughed aloud, and she said unto those 2 knights, "Messieurs, behold, yonder is the gardener's boy, who weareth his cap continually because he hath an ugly place upon his head." Then the 2 knights, knowing who that gardener boy was exceedingly abashed at his speech, and wist not what to say or whither to look. And Sir Gawain spake aside unto Sir Owain, and quoth this, "For heaven, that lady knoweth not what manner of man is yonder gardener boy, for, an she did, she would be more sparing of her speech." And the Lady Guinevere heard Sir Gawain, that he spoke, but she did not hear his words, So she turned it on to Sir Gawain, and she said, Sir Gawain, haply it doth affront thee that gardener's boy should wear his cap before us, and maybe thou wilt go and take it off from his head, as thou didst offer to do 2 or 3 days since. And Sir Gawain said, Peace, lady, thou knowest not what you sayest. Yonder gardener's boy could more easily take my head from off my shoulders than I could take his cap from off his head. At this the Lady Guinevere made open laughter, but in her heart she secretly pondered that saying, and greatly marvelled at what Sir Gawain meant thereby. Now about noon of that day there came a herald from King Rence of North Wales, and he appeared boldly before King Leodegrance, where the king sat in his hall with a number of his people about him. And the herald said, My lord king, my master, King Rence of North Wales, is greatly displeased with thee. For thou didst set certain knights upon Duke Mordaunt of Northumber, and those knights have slain that excellent nobleman, who was close kin unto King Rence. Moreover, thou hast made no reply to those demands that my master, King Rence, hath made touching the delivery unto him of certain lands and castles bordering upon North Wales. Wherefore my master is affronted with thee beyond measure. So my master, King Rence, bids me to set forth with these 2 conditions, and the conditions are these. Firstly, that thou dost immediately deliver into his hands that white knight who slew the Duke of Northumber. And secondly, that thou makest immediate promise that those lands in question shall be presently delivered unto King Rence. Then King Leodegrance arose from where he sat, and spake to the herald with great dignity of demeanour. Sir herald, quoth he, the demands that King Rence maketh upon me pass all bounds for insolence. That death which the Duke of Northumber suffered, he suffered because of his own pride and folly. Nor would I deliver that white knight into thy master's hands, even an I were able to do so. As for those lands that thy master demandeth of me, thou mayst tell King Rence that I will not deliver unto him of those lands so much as a single blade of grass, or a single grain of corn that groweth thereon. And the herald said, If so be, that is thine answer, King Leodegrance, then I am bidden for to tell thee that my master, King Rence of North Wales, will presently come hither with an array of great force of arms, and will take from thee by force those things which thou wilt not deliver unto him peacefully. Whereupon, so saying, he departed thence and went his way. Now, after the herald had departed, King Leodegrance went into his closet, and when he had come there, he sent privately for the Lady Guinevere. So the Lady Guinevere came to him where he was. And King Leodegrance said to her, My daughter, it hath happened that a knight clad in all white, and bearing no crested device of any sort, hath twice come to our rescue, and hath overthrown our enemies. Now it is said by every one that knight is thine own particular champion, and I hear that he wore thy necklace as a favour when he first went out against the Duke of Northumber. Now I prithee, daughter, tell me who that white champion is, and where he may be found. Then the Lady Guinevere was overwhelmed with a confusion, wherefore she looked away from her father's countenance, and she said, Verily, my lord, I do not know who that knight may be. Then King Leodegrance spoke very seriously to the Lady Guinevere, and he took her by the hand and said, My daughter, thou art now of an age where thou must consider being mated unto a man, who may duly cherish thee and protect thee from thine enemies. For lo, I grow apace in years, and may not hope to defend thee away from these perils that encompass one of our estate. Moreover, since King Arthur, who is a very great king indeed, hath brought peace unto this realm, all that noble court of chivalry which one time gathered about me has been scattered elsewhere, where greater adventures may be found than in my peaceful realm. Wherefore, as all the world has seen this week past, I have now not one single knight whom I may depend on to defend us in such times of perils as these which now overshadow us. Now, my daughter, it doth appear to me that thou couldst not hope to find anyone who could so well safeguard thee as this white knight, for he doth indeed appear to be a champion of extraordinary powers and strength. Wherefore, it would be well if thou didst feel thyself to incline unto him, as he appeareth to incline unto thee. Then the Lady Guinevere became all rosy red, as with a fire even unto her throat, and she laughed, albeit with tears overflowing her eyes, and ran down upon her cheeks. So she wept, yet laughed in weeping. And she said unto King Leodegrance, My lord and father, an I give my liking unto any one in the manner thou speakest of, I will give it only unto the poor gardener's boy who digs in my garden. Then, at these words, the countenance of King Leodegrance became contracted with violent anger, and he cried out, Ha, lady! Wouldst thou make a mock and jest my words? Then the Lady Guinevere said, Indeed, my lord, I jest not, and I mock not. Moreover, I tell thee that for verity, that same gardener boy know more concerning the White Champion than anybody else in all the world. And then King Leodegrance said, What is this thou tellest me? And the Lady Guinevere said, Send for the gardener's boy, and thou shalt know. And King Leodegrance said, Verily, there is more in this than I may at present understand. So he called to him the chief of his pages, hight Dorisand, and he said to him, Go, Dorisand, and bring hither the gardener's boy from the Lady Guinevere's garden. So Dorisand, the page, went as King Leodegrance commanded, and in a little while he returned, bringing with him that gardener's boy. And with them came Sir Gawain, and Sir Owain, and Sir Pelleas, and Sir Geraint. And those four lords stood over against the door where they entered. But the gardener's boy came and stood beside the table where King Leodegrance sat. And the king lifted up his eyes and looked upon the gardener's boy, and he said, Ha! Wouldst thou wear thy cap in our presence? Then the gardener's boy said, I cannot take off my cap. But the Lady Guinevere, who stood beside the chair of King Leodegrance, spake and said, I do beseech thee, messire, for to take off thy cap unto my father. Whereupon the gardener's boy said, At thy bidding, I will take it off. So he took the cap from off his head, and King Leodegrance beheld his face and knew him. And when he saw who it was, he stood before him. He made a great outcry from pure amazement, and he said, My lord and my king, what is this? Thereupon he arose from where he sat, and he went and kneeled down onto the ground before King Arthur. And he set the palms of his hands together, and he put his hands within the hands of King Arthur. And King Arthur took the hands of King Leodegrance within his own. And King Leodegrance said, my lord, is it then thou who hast done all these wonderful things? Then King Arthur said, Yea, such as those things were, I have done them. And he stooped and kissed King Leodegrance upon the cheek, and lifted him up onto his feet, and gave him words of good cheer. Now the Lady Guinevere, when she beheld those things had passed, was astonished beyond measure. And lo, she understood of a sudden all these things with amazing clearness. Wherefore a great fear fell upon her, so that she trembled exceedingly, and said unto herself, What things have I said unto this great king, and how have I made a mock of him and a jest of him before all those who were about me? And at the thought thereof she set her hand upon his side, for to still the extreme disturbance of her heart. So, whilst King Arthur and King Leodegrance gave each other words of royal greeting and of compliment, she withdrew herself and went and stood over against the window nigh to the corner of the wall. Then, by and by, King Arthur lifted up his eyes and beheld her where she stood afar off. And he went straightway unto her, and he took her by the hand, and he said, Lady, what cheer? And she said, Lord, I am afeard of thy greatness. And he said, Nay, lady, rather it is I am who am afeard of thee, for thy kind regard is dearer unto me than anything else in all the world. Else I should have not served for those 12 days as gardener boy in thy garden for the sake of thy good will. And she said, Thou hast my good will, Lord. And he said, Have I thy good will in great measure? And she said, Yea, thou hast in great measure. Then he stooped his head and kissed her before all those were there, and thus their troth was plighted. Then King Leodegrance was filled with such an exceeding joy that he wist not how to contain himself therefore. Now after these things there followed a war with King Ryns of North Wales. For Sir Kay and Sir Ulfius had gathered together a great army as King Arthur had bidden them to do. So that when King Ryns came against Camelot, he was altogether routed, and his army dispersed, and himself chased, and outcast, into his mountains. Then there was great rejoicing in Camelot, For, after his victory, King Arthur remained there for a while with an exceedingly splendid court of noble lords and of beautiful ladies. And there was feasting and jousting and many famous bouts of fun, the like of which those parts have never before beheld. And King Arthur and Lady Guinevere were altogether happy together. Now, one day, while King Arthur sat at a feast with King Leodegrance, they two being exceedingly expanded with cheerfulness, King Leodegrance said unto King Arthur, My lord, what shall I offer thee for a dowry with my daughter, when thou hast taken her away from me for to be thy queen? Then King Arthur turned to Merlin, who stood nigh to him, and said, Ha, Merlin, what shall I demand of my friend by the way of that dowry? Unto him Merlin said, My lord king, thy friend King Leodegrance hath one thing, the which, should he bestow it upon thee, will singularly increase the glory and renown of thy reign, so that the fame thereof shall never be forgotten. And King Arthur said, I bid thee, Merlin, tell me what is that thing. So Merlin said, My lord king, I will tell thee a story. In the days of thy father, Uther Pendragon, I caused to be made for him a certain table in the shape of a ring, wherefore men called it the Round Table. Now at this table were seats for 50 men, and these seats were designed for the 50 knights who were the most worthy knights in all the world. These seats were of such a sort that whenever a worthy knight appeared, then his name appeared in the letters of gold upon that seat that appertained unto him. And when that knight died, then would his name suddenly vanish from that seat where he had aforetime occupied. Now 49 of these seats, except the one seat, were altogether alike, saving only one that was set aside for the king himself, which the same was elevated above the other seats, and was cunningly carved and inlaid with ivory and with gold. And the one seat was different from all the others, and it was called the Seat Perilous, for the seat was unlike the others in both its structure and its significance. For it was all cunningly inset with gold and silver of curious device, and it was covered with a canopy of satin embroidered with gold and silver, and it was altogether a wonderful magnificence of appearance. And no name ever appeared upon this seat, for only one knight in all of the world could hope to sit therein with safety unto himself. For, if any other dared to sit therein, either he would die a sudden and violent death within 3 days' time, or else a great misfortune would befall him. Hence that seat was called the Seat Perilous. Now, in the days of King Uther Pendragon, there sat 37 knights at the Round Table, and when King Uther Pendragon died, he gave the Round Table unto his friend King Leodegrance of Camelot. And in the beginning of King Leodegrance's reign, there sat 24 knights at the Round Table. But times have changed since then, and the glory of King Leodegrance's reign hath paled before the glory of thy reign, so that his noble court of knights have altogether quitted him. Wherefore there remaineth now not one name, saving only the name of King Leodegrance, upon all those 50 seats that surround the Round Table. So now that Round Table lieth beneath its pavilion, altogether unused. Yet, if King Leodegrance will give that table unto thee, my lord king, that Round Table, for a dower with the Lady Guinevere, then it will lend unto thy reign its greatest glory. For, in thy day, every seat of that table shall be filled, even unto the Seat Perilous, and the fame of the knights who sit in it shall never be forgotten. Ha! Quoth King Arthur, that would indeed be a dower worthy for any king to have with his queen. Then King Leodegrance said, That dower thou shalt have with my daughter, and if it bring thee great glory, then shall thy glory be my glory, and thy renown shall be my renown. For, if my glory shall wane, and thy glory shall increase, behold, is not my child thy wife? And King Arthur said, Thou sayest well and wisely. Thus King Arthur became the master of that famous Round Table, and the Round Table was set up in Camelot, which some men now call Winchester. And by they gathered about it such an array of knights as the world had never beheld before that time, and which it shall never behold again. Such was the history of the beginning of the Round Table in King Arthur's reign.